closing opposition. We think that the distinction is obviously that the European Union is a trading body that can be a bargaining and a political representative that also can create trade deals, right? That is distinct from the Eurozone, which is the common currency. For example, the European Union can represent a number of states that don't trade on the euro that still can reap the benefits of trade, right? To that extent, we think that the extension is largely non-unique. We're going to do a couple of responses there as well. A few pieces of extraneous rebuttal before the two big questions in the debate. So first, the CEO, the member of opposition, stands up and they say that every state sits on the board, so it's okay because you still make democratic decisions, right? But note the distinction of what Salil says, right? It's that when a country like Greece is supposed to recover by devaluing the euro, that's necessarily going to harm Germany, that's necessarily going to harm every other of the 35 states in the eurozone, because devaluing the euro in Greece is going to devalue the euro across the eurozone, right? So what does that mean in terms of the voting body? It means that while Greece may be voting to devalue the euro, unfortunately, the 34 other states on that board are never going to vote for that same policy. We say that that's fundamentally harmful. On a principle level, it's unjustified, but also on a practical level, it means that Greece can never realize the benefits of recovery. But then they talk about this argument about monetary manipulation. They say that these politicians have no long-term incentives. They're going to manipulate money and the monetary policy in the short term to try and create some sort of artificial recovery. Two responses. One, Salil outlines credible long-term recovery methods like the IMF proposal that create long-term loaning strategies, right? We don't think that it's mutually exclusive, that somehow if you're off the common currency, there's no long-term path for economic recovery, right? We don't think that that's warranted at all. But secondly, on a principle level, understand that if there is a trade-off between short-term recovery and long-term prosperity, that is a decision that these countries individually ought to make. We hear no principle justification for why these individual countries ought to be making some sort of, no principle justification for why these governing bodies or economic unions ought to be making these decisions for individual countries like Greece. Then quickly, on this idea of Syriza and the rise of Syriza because of Islamophobia, right? Two things. One, just as a distinction, these alt-right and alt-left groups that oppose globalization have always existed. We agree. The problem is the rise to prominence hasn't been since the 1970s, but rather they've gained power specifically because of economic grievances, right? It's because it's not just the vocal people who cry out against Islamophobia, but it's rather also the silent majority who's willing to sit down and vote with these people because of the economic hardships that they have suffered. Understand that the only way that these people get in power is because the silent majority that suffers from economic suffering and economic tumult are created from the common currency. Only then do you create the power that Syriza actually has. So then quickly on this this opposition extension about trade. So on internal trade, we think that the actual benefit is very marginal. To say that, Austria increased their trade by 300%, they're not giving you a distinction between the Eurozone and just being a part of the European Union. They're not giving you the isolated benefit from having a common currency as opposed to having, open borders, having regulated labor standards that are independent from a common currency, right? They give you no justification for why a common currency is necessary in that regard, but on external trade, this is more important. First, we would say, again, that this is the European Union, not the Eurozone. That's a completely important distinction that we think is missed on closing opposition. But also, second, recognize the converse, right? That is, that countries individually who want to strike trade deals, if their argument is true, can also be vetoed and prevented from making those trade deals, right? It means that if a country like Greece wants to make a trade deal that the European Union or the Eurozone or whatever body they're talking about thinks is not beneficial to the entire Union, that means that these countries are prevented from doing so. We say on a principle level that's unjustified, but also on a practical level that's harmful for these countries. I'll take opening.
Thank you. So government's main argument is that stronger countries will look out for their own economic interests. But with common currencies, their own economic interests are tangibly linked with the economic interests of everyone within the currency zone, incentivizing accountability in ways that trade deals simply do not.
We don't see the warrant for that argument. We think that countries that trade with each other necessarily are integrated and linked in the same way. We don't think that there's any degree of change coming from opposition bench about why the common currency somehow moves the needle. But again, we're going to talk about recovery flexibility. The first question in the debate is, how does a common currency actually affect economic recovery, right? We think that Salil does a really good job of coming up and fleshing out the nitty-gritty from what opening government talks about, right? We think that Salil gives you the mechanisms for why common currencies actually prevent economic recovery. Notice that he talks about things like the inability to devalue a currency, for example, the inability to adjust interest rates. These are things fundamentally that are prevented, that the individual countries are prevented from doing because of the inability to actually affect the currency in one country without without affecting it elsewhere, right? But he also talks about the scapegoat argument. It's that the common currency becomes a magnet for criticism that prevents long-term structural reform. What happens then? It means that countries like Greece are unable to independently create structural reform. It means that there's no independent flexibility, right? Independent currencies allow for, like the comparative is that independent currencies allow for the recovery when we have had no principal justification or practical justification for the contrary, right? We don't think that it's okay to just come up here and flippantly deride the drachma for being an old currency when we think that is a perfectly valuable comparative, right? So recognize that this is the comparative. In our world, absent a successful recovery policy, it means that Greece is, in a world of common currency, absent a successful recovery policy, Greece is harmed. The problem is pursuit of that successful recovery policy harms a big country like Germany, right? In our world with no common currency, we can pursue the recovery policy in Greece while not harming a big country like Germany, right? We don't understand why the comparative has to be that one country has to lose and one country has to win. We say that independent currencies allow for that success on both sides of the house. For both countries on our side of the house. The second question is, who is better off making, or are countries better off making collective decisions? Important here, right? First, we've talked about the principal justification already. We say that it's not right for larger bodies to dictate what smaller countries can do, right? We talk about responses to their trade arguments. Sillot talks also generally about what it means when larger governing bodies make undemocratic decisions that are not responsive and disconnected from people like in Greece, right? But what Sillot also does that is not responded to sufficiently is also the practical implications, right? He tells you that as a result of these economic policies, people in Greece were disenchanted, they were disenfranchised, they felt like there was no representation for their government. The problem there is, on the comparative, if you think that globalization isn't good, you ought to vote for side government because we're the ones who are showing you mechanistic reasons for why in the long term you're creating less globalization, you're turning back the clock on global progress, right? And if you think globalization is bad, then you should obviously be voting for side government. Very happy to oppose.